It's standalone presentation.
Yeah.
Chiricha kosokulanda fyonse
Asamba tunugo episodes.
tambiri mukufunda kumo.
Oh yeah.
So I'm not going to try and go too far.
Kanshi nshire shokulanda okutira twiye sana.
I'll try and just do something condensed that we can have as standing alone.
Chinaraisha fyo kutitako okulanda kofimo ifimanine fefieka.
Something that was said at the last camp meeting.
Ifintu fimo fyalandirwepo mukulongana kwa fumako kwanza.
I'm going to continue to bring up this point in the future.
Naraisha okwewa tinkalete ikishikomo kuntanshi.
When we started discussing two streams of information in 2018,
Ilo twatendeki okusambirira pa milonga ibiri ya Mariashi mu 2018.
there was two issues in the movement.
Kwaliko milandu ibiri mu movement.
One, most of the movement was looking at the wrong stream of information.
Vamo movement balelesha kumulonga umo o shiribuye ufi.
And the second problem,
Elo wafya wa bubiri.
most of the leadership didn't even believe we should be looking at external information.
Elio abenge abali mu butungulu shitabale fwano ko yatwalesha kuli lolu balirumbirwa kunshe kumulonga umo.
They saw external journalism as dangerous.
Amwene kutira okulosha kumfwako kubalera nda kunse ama journalist chiricha
Especially the present.
na kuchirisha panshita ino tufikire.
We had to fight both of those errors when we began to speak about two streams of information.
Nganshi turingire okulwa n'okuchimpya ayo mikuso shibirire tuletontooganya fye kulanda kwa milonga ibiri.
I did the painful and unthinkable for me.
Ndeona kutira cha kukalipwa kaili chirafirwa n'okutontonkanya kuline.
I went back and listened to myself.
Yakunuma n'okuyikutika kuline mwine.
The last presentation of the last camp meeting.
Kisambiro kyakulekeresha mu kulonga n'okwafuma.
Where we took the position as a movement.
Apa po twasendere olutampulo nga movement.
That understanding LGBT issues biblically.
Okutira okwiruka oyumulandu w'ama LGBT.
We accepted them as LGBT within the movement.
Twabapokerere n'okubasumina okutira efine baba ba LGBT balingirire okubeera efine movement.
Not just as members.
Kubapokera fye okutira babe fye firundwa fye.
But the freedom to live LGBT.
Leero n'obuntungwa obwakwikala efyo fine baba ba LGBT.
In the eyes of God and his movement.
Mumenso ya kwalesa eryo naino movement.
Practicing LGBT.
Okulati tefyo fine fya LGBT.
Gay marriage, not just in the civil wedding, but the religious.
Eryo ne fyupo fyawe fyamage tekwebati fifye kuteko kulyati kufyasumisha pero na
I wanted to
mumpe.
remember the wording that I used.
Ndefo okwimusha amashiwo nabo mfeshe.
But one thing stood out for me even stronger as I watched.
Lero ekintu kimo kyayimanine ku kimu kyakosa sana eryo naleetamu.
The power of the formalization is not in that last presentation.
Amaka yakubikwa kwa mbira pamoja yali muri sambiro kyakulekeresha.
The real power was in everything that built up to that point.
Amaka yatuntulu yali muri byonse filiya yalengere tufike kuti.
The last 3 years, we could argue.
Myaka itatu kuti iyo twapitamo yapita.
And we could argue the last 2 years.
Nakutirisha nalimo yapita ibiri.
The last 32 years.
Yapita 32 years.
The last 18 months.
Yapita emyeshi 18.
Or just the camp meeting itself.
Nangula fye kulongana kwanza ko kwapitire fye kwita.
That's where the power came from.
Uko ekwafuminya amaka.
Within Adventism, there is conservative and liberal.
Mukatika bakalolera mwali bama liberal na ba conservative mubali.
I tackled head-on the mindset and position that conservative Adventism takes to LGBT issues.
Aishokulanda pasyo awama conservative bakalolera balanda pamulandu wama LGBT.
But Elder Parminder dismantled the best that liberalism has to offer.
Ero chikupira Parminder aliyesesho kubongolola yonse fyama liberal na bena bakwata okwimanina panangu kulanda.
So I spoke to the conservatives and Elder Parminder spoke to the liberals.
Kanshi na lirangire pama conservative ero Parminder na ena alanda pama liberals.
Because the best that liberal Adventism can offer to understand this subject
Bantu ichofe icha kwirikecho bakalolera bengalanda pali ijitsambiriro.
is either throwaway inspiration
Yani mokoyo feti munshire ya kuti bakose fya
or
kudwa
lead a pained and lonely life with celibacy.
Eyo no kuikala omwewo akutira bekale abashimbe mya ya kutire bwasuko
And the
kuli.
reason that this movement is able to avoid both ditches
Ero no mulandu akutira I movement iringire yatangu kulisho byonse kubiri sambiriro.
because under God's leading, He has led us to understand parable methodology.
Amulandu akabati mutungushi kwa kwaleso watupera kuwonfya inshira ya kusomera.
Weight and importance of history.
Ero no kulepa
On one side of the board, we drew 1989 to present.
wa kusomera shijaka lero no rubali rumo lwa kusomera mu 1989.
We addressed methodology and the reform line.
Twa lore shepa kumana methodology
The parable
elio
that gay marriage has been since 1989.
umurumbe wa kumana 1989
And all that Cana and the other reform lines tell us of our history.
elio
On the other side of the board, we laid out about 2,500 years.
ero kulubali rumbi lwa bodi twaresha kutira pamyaka eyo 2000
And saw the homophobia that has come not from Christianity,
anshi uyu mwensono lupato pali ababa nensuta lwafumina kunsi eyo.
but it existed all through that history as a relic of paganism.
Awe chena chai kalira fiyo kufuma kunstoko okutira awe byaba senshi.
Then when you combine methodology and history,
Lero no mbangu mwasankanya nshira ya kusomena mo elio neria shiria kale.
so much opens up.
Ifingi viresa mkwisuka.
So we could say 2 streams of information.
Anshi kututwalanda ati milonga ibiri yali ashi.
What is the stream?
Umulonga chinshi.
What are both streams?
ng'emirongo ibiri ne kinshi.
I would argue they're both not just a source, but journalism.
Leero ine nalanda okutira tentulo fe ya mirongo leero nderanda okutira byonsi birina
People use Twitter as a source.
amutobankani.
Instagram, Facebook, YouTube.
Abantu baraba onki ya Twitter, Instagram, Facebook.
We've been talking journalism.
Fwevo twaleranda byonse pali inshira ya kusabankanisha mweliasi.
That's what we see in 1996 formalized.
Kanshi ifefe tule muna 1996 kile biko pamo.
I thought today, for the short time we have,
Na tontongene kutira ilero panchite ine inono tukwete.
considering the date,
Okulolesha palili ushiku
I've
wine.
become aware how little as a movement we understand the history of Islam.
Ningwato kuturuka okumana ifyo nga movement wakwato kukwata okuiruka pali kama Muslim panono.
So I just want to go through history.
Kanshi ndefu afyo kuya muri ashiria kale.
And in doing that,
Ero mukitefyo.
I want to make just a few points about two streams of information.
Ndefu okupanga kofe ekikomo kimu pali mirongo ibiri yali ashi.
That will probably continue on at a later date.
Ndesubirai katwalirira pali panshitayimbi.
So I want to discuss not all of Islamic history, of course,
Kanshityo ndefu tekulanda pali Israeli Islam yonse fye awo.
but the key points that led us to 9/11.
Leero ifikomo kalankala ifyatulengeri okwisa kuli 9/11.
And the war with radical Islam that extended particularly to 2019.
Ero no bulwiwa pakati ka Islam yu kondoka abaleta no bulukisa ku 9/11.
We're going to pick it up in the 1700s.
Kanshi twalambira muri wa 1700.
I've been asked to write the names.
Esho kulemba amashina apa.
Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab.
Muhammad.
The translators will speak to you after the presentation, I can tell. He lived from 1703 to 1792.
Akere okufuma mu 1793 kwisaka mu 1802.
So this is a man from the 1700s. He became very influential.
Aishireva sana wa Maka.
Very controversial.
Abira aishireva wa
He sought to revive and
sana.
purify Islam from what he perceived as non-Islamic popular religious beliefs and practices by returning to what he believed were the fundamental principles of the Islamic religion. This should be the top of your...
Aishireva ukurusha yena nokusangurura Islamu okufuma kuli fyefye alemo nokutira tefyamu kama Muslim mpepere na mufusumyo na mmichitire. Nokubwerera kuli icho ekyasumine okutira awo efikomo nefishintiriro ifyampepere ya Islam.
So 1700s, he says we're going to purify Islam.
Anshi muri ba 1700 yomwe na ibiro kutatwala sangurura Islam.
1700s, he says they're going to purify Islam.
Kanshi mu 17 limwe kutira twala sangulula Islam.
And in his main theological treatise, he presents a strong anti-Christian and anti-Judaic stance. He saw it as his mission to restore a more pure and original form of the faith of Islam, and he advocated for a literalist interpretation of the Quran and its laws.
Kanshena tumwene kutire piringire okusangululwa bwino ikisumino kyama Muslim gaira mwene kutire piringire fyafundo no sambirishwa no kwirula Quran nefunde yaiko.
So there are two branches of Islam.
Yansha kutumamona dipali impande
Sunni and
Islam.
Shia.
Kuli Amasuni na Amashia.
Within Sunni, there's about 4 schools of thought.
One
of these is Wahabism. It developed from this man. And it is the most radical and the most conservative.
Now,
this was not particularly popular. He was rejected by his father and his brother. He was expelled from his territory. And when he was expelled, someone invited him and said, "Come to my territory." The ruler of Diriyah. So the ruler of Diriyah tells Wahab, "Come live with me." And that ruler was Muhammad bin Saud. Now 1700s, who is Muhammad bin Saud?
1700 Muhammad bin Saud ni nani?
Why is this called the Saudi Arabian Peninsula?
Saudi
Peninsula. Because it's ruled by the House of Saud. It would be like calling Australia the island of Lambert. It's the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. It's named after one family.
Saudi Arabia Peninsula.
So in the 1700s, it was actually 1744.
1774.
These two men went into an agreement.
And
Muhammad bin Saud said, "I'll take care of the government." Wahab take care of the religion. And will govern the secular government and the religion of this peninsula. It's been a power sharing arrangement. It has remained in place for nearly 300 years. This is what gave the House of Saud so much religious legitimacy. So there was this political religious alliance
kuliko ukwampana kwa buteko n'emipepere.
And the House of Saud had both successes and failures.
Inganda ya kwa Saudi bonse bali kwete abakutyana.
And when in the 1930s they've had this alliance with Wahabist nomadic militias.
Eyo muri ba 1930s umukayo bakwete kwampana pamo nabo.
They finally achieved full success.
Nabo bakwete okukwate fino kufika po kutira mukula chimpye.
And they set up the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Ngepelande kutira ufumu wa Saudi Arabia.
Run by the House of Saud.
Obutungululwa n'olupwa lwa kwa Saudi.
But this has been a 300-year religious and political alliance that's enabled this.
Kanchitina tuchasendea kutira miaka itatu ya kwampani na moya ishindukwa.
And I'll remind you, Wahabism was not a dominant sect of Islam.
Ero kutuma mwana kutira Muhammad akwato kuko maka Islam. Kanchi kuliko uwafyomu.
They want to run this peninsula.
Bene wale fo kutungulula inchende ya peninsula.
And in this peninsula is Mecca and Medina.
Eyo muri inchende ya peninsula muri Medina na Mecca.
The two holiest sites of Islam.
Inchende shibiri isha mushiro muchi Islam.
Mecca and Medina.
Kanshi Mecca na Medina.
So the problem this royal family has
Kanshi wafia ubo ishin ndubasha kwete kwa kutira.
is they belong to this little minority group of Islam.
Ngachakitira baba chiptulwa cha kuri libumba lyama.
And they know that all of these other Muslims are going to say,
Na besho kutira ifensa ma Muslim bakarando kutira. Sho bakarando.
what have you little Wahhabi small sect, what right do you have to rule the holy sites?
Bakesa ndo kutira imuma habi mwe bantu abanono finch mulechida kuri shinchendesha mushiro.
Quoting from our document for the translators.
Abdullah Mashui.
This is from the conversation.
Film kulanshanya.
Quote 4.
Ambia pa 4.
It's titled Explainer, What is Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia? Central to the Saudis' military and political success was their renewed alliance with pro-Wahhabi nomadic militias known literally as the Brotherhood. Ever since, Wahhabi ideology has been central to the survival and legitimacy of the state of Al Saud.
Kanshi pakati kama Saudi abashirika elio na abakansa fyachalo wali okuchimpya mukubwekeshamu buli obwampano wabo abaletungirira uyu mutundu ama Wahabi abashirika wale tuko kutira mumashui atundu kutira
From roughly the 1950s on, the Wahhabi ulama, they are Islamic scholars, were increasingly co-opted by the House of Al Saud to provide religious legitimacy as it tightened its grip on power against tribal rivals and consolidated Saudi Arabian nationalism, as opposed to Nazarite pan-Arabism.
Kanshi kufuma muri wa 1950s ukuya kuntanshi Wahabi ulama umusambisho wa Islamu ena twalirire kaina okusungirira ing'anda yakwa osaudi kutungirira okusambirisha ubutindamye bwowe n'okwikatisha kutira kikafumishiwa kweti kyamaka kuli awo wensaye nga fwayo okulisha olulukola amasaudi okutira bena ebene bakyalo eki.
So that they know that to legitimize their rule of the holy sites, they needed to use religion.
Anshi badishimye kutira pakuti bena kyabe kyafikapo okutira bayikalira pene balingirira okubompya emipepere.
Show that they were the true and pure branch of Islam.
Okwikatira okulanda okutira bena erubutoro tuntuluka bino lwasanguluko lwa Kiislamu.
This process of legitimization included Wahhabi policing of the Sharia-based legal systems and education.
Anshi olumishire yakutwalira okulatungirira ficha Wahabi na kula koseresha ekyaba kyaba mu misambirishishe eriyo na mu masukulu.
And a whole lot of discrimination against women.
Ero nolulu balirwa kubika banamayo pambali kutira tabalingire okubefyo.
Then they encounter another turning point.
Ero na pambi chikomo kimo apa kwalukira kwa fintu.
In 1938.
Mu mwaka wa 1938.
6 years after they take power.
Emyaka 6 panu mabasenda
An oil well in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, drilled into what would soon be identified as the largest source of petroleum in the world.
Chiba cha mafuta mu Saudi Arabia, Dhahran, chaisa kwata ubingwa icho chaishika kutira nomba chibe chakulisha kwe cha mafuta mu chalo jonse.
Now comes the dilemma that is Saudi Arabia.
Ero nomba chaba wabo wafyo mu Saudi Arabia.
Incredibly conservative.
Ero bene mufika kobe na ma conservative.
Needing to legitimize their rule by spreading that Wahhabi branch.
Okwikatira kubutungulushi kupitira mukulasa bankanya yemi sambishe yakwa wapi.
But where are they going to sell the oil?
It's going
to go to the West. So this extremely conservative government, new nation, is all of a sudden extremely wealthy. Closely beginning to work and interact with the West. From the 1930s to the 1970s, they're spreading Wahabism.
Then
1979 comes. Now we know 1979 from Afghanistan.
Number 1979 mu Afghanistan.
We know that begins a 10-year war. Proxy war of the Cold War. Which leads to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. So we know that over here in Afghanistan there's a civil war developing. But this is only one of 4 things happening in 1979. That changes the Islamic world. Another is Pakistan.
katitikamu chiteva nensoma Islam chimbi
It had
mpali
been
Pakistan.
an incredibly progressive country.
Nakubana cho chichalo chintu chimwe chava chakuloreshapo
And
sana.
someone comes in and overthrows that and brings in Sharia law.
Iyo umwaisa nokuweva tikufumyapo ifino kubikapo ifintu ife fyabo.
It's awful to read the first-hand accounts of the women that went through that. So that's happening in 1978, 1979.
Kanchi ifyo vile isukana ukuchitika mu 1970s na 79.
We know what happens in Iran.
Na kuishiba ifyo chitike mu Iran.
That overthrow of the government, and then they have this radical Shia.
Okufumishiwa kwa uteko wowa alipo nokuleta kwa Shia.
That becomes a extremely oppressive church-state union.
Elo chasanga nombo uteko wa mipepele wa mpenene mipepele kisha.
But I want us to talk about Saudi Arabia in 1979.
Therefore, Pali Saudi Arabia 1979.
See, Saudi Arabia had been spreading this radical Wahabist conservatism.
Kanshi Saudi Arabia na ale kwa tokia ale sawanganya imi sambilishe ya kwa Wahabi.
But the problem, the dilemma has been they don't live up to it.
Lero uwafia uwa lipo uwa kwete.
The royal family, kind of like Donald Trump, don't live up to what they preach religiously.
Ngolulu poaru akubofu butira tawulingire okulekera ko kuli kyo mwasumino amipepere.
The very people they've been proselytizing turn on them.
Butira tabekala ifyo bafunda baya nga Trump.
In 1979, there was a siege in Mecca.
Kashi 1979 kwaba okuikatana ngubuisho pali Mecca.
In a stunning strike, a band of 500 Saudi extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca for 2 weeks, publicly calling Saudi rulers puppets of the West and traitors to true Islam.
Kanshi kwabo kulwa ukuikatana ni abantu over 500 abakondokero uteko baikata mosque ere na Mecca pamilungu ibiri kwita shisha mfumwa Saudi gutira bayese.
So the leader of the attack says that the House of Saud has lost its legitimacy.
Balekereko kuwa mpano bakwatana baba abakwest ero bala ndio gutira balingire n'abafuma.
They were corrupt, they loved money.
N'abafuma mufyo bayiminine ko efituntulu bali abakowera n'abatemengera okupitira mu kuleeta waba West.
So what the House of Saud has feared all along happened in 1979.
Kanshi chonse chocho baleetinga lyonse eri aba olukola w'Amasaudi ekyasitika mu 1979.
Where conservative Islamists said, you, this family, have no right to rule Mecca and Medina.
Ilio amakonservative w'Amaisilamu batiri okutira imwe mweruko imwe tamukwete ensango ishakulateka Medina na Mecca.
It took them 2 weeks, but they finally overran and freed the Grand Mosque.
Kyasendera emilungu ibiri leero wiperepere baisakwata okufumishiwa ko n'okusha.
Hundreds of people died.
Imitapendwa nangu abantu abengi balifiire
The
sana.
mosque was full when the siege began.
Bamulandu wako bati mosque mwali iswiri abantu ili obulu.
So what do they do now to prove to everyone they are the legitimate rulers?
Constitution mbejo balekita kuleka bashiningisha okutira entungulu shebe ne balingire okulatungulula abafika.
They need to show Wahabism in the state.
Balingire okulanga Wahabism mu buteeko.
And they need to export it.
Eyo balingire n'okusenda Wahabism.
They began by banning photographs of women in newspapers.
Ambire okulangisha banamayi ma newspapers.
taking women off television,
nokulanga bana mayo pa TV,
changing all their school curriculum.
ero nokwalula ifitani kofia family
So because of the threat to their legitimacy in 1979,
bamulandiwa kutina ekyo ikyakitike mu 1979 kutira ebalingire fyo okuteeka
the House of Saud, with renewed fervor, are intent on spreading Wahabism.
oluko lwa Saudi mukumona ilishukwele bakweteri akusabangalisha mu Wahabism,
showing themselves as the true and the pure sect.
okulangisha bene okutira eba kwirika kaira basanguluka okuba abayibera.
One of the things they do in the 1980s is confiscate the Quran.
Ekintu kimu kyo batire muri 1989 mu kufisa Quran, pokolera n'okufisa.
And the government sets up all of these printing presses.
Ere n'obuteeko waiseera omumonsomo baalepangira amabuku.
They construct their own version of the Quran.
Baipangira okupangira amabuku abe ne baipangira na Qurani wabo,
which is the Quran with all Wahhabi commentary.
Yeah, bali Qurani yakwatamo na fyonse filani fyo Wahabi.
It's like if we printed, if we took all the Bibles of Adventists and then printed our own Bible with our own movement commentary.
Then they
translate it into English. At the height, they were printing 8 million copies a year. And then they flooded the world with this amended Quran that had Wahhabi commentary. Remember, a few decades ago, this was a minority sect. And a very conservative, radical one. So one passage in the Quran that's addressing Allah says, those who earned your anger. Then in brackets, the Wahhabi commentary. They've added in such as the Jews. All of those who went astray, now in brackets, such as the Christians. This has become the dominant Quran today. So there's a lot of effort that they've put in different avenues to legitimize their rule. But the key point was given to them with the Afghanistan war. A relative progressive country, Pakistan, I won't give his full name, he's just known as Zia. Came to Pakistan in 1978. He brings in Sharia law. And for the women that lived through that, if you hear their stories, it's just really sad. To see the human rights that they had developed through that country for women just crumble in a day.
okulosha kuti lensambu shabo shebakwetenga abantu muri lyanshita shao naike muni bula bwino bushikwapi enyoyi.
Soviet Union invades Afghanistan.
Soviet Union yakwata okuingirira Afghanistan.
Pakistan sees that as a threat.
Pakistan yamana okutira ngusansusano kyakutinya.
Partly because of this oil arrangement, Saudi Arabia is already allied to the United States.
Eyo okumana okutira kulina ali kumeria shikuli oilo elo ni Saudi Arabia kale kale yali bangwa mpano na America.
And they form a three-way alliance.
Eyo bapanga okwigatana kutatu.
Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, United States, Pakistan.
Anshi Saudi Arabia, United States, and Pakistan.
Towards this end of the Cold War, the United States spent about $8 billion ensuring the Soviet Union lost that war.
America is spending $8 billion to Soviet Union.
The Saudi Arabia matched that.
And Saudi Arabia,
Saudi Arabia spent about $8 billion on this war as well.
In Saudi Arabia, America.
Because they saw it another opportunity too. Spread Wahabism.
Wahabism.
Islamic fighters to kick out the Soviet Union had descended on this country from all corners.
Kanshi abama Islam kutira bafunyepo Soviet Union bafumine mumpeto
Tens
shonse.
of thousands of Muslims descended on Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union.
Kanshi mintapendwe India ma Islam bafumine kwa lekana kwisa obishafie ma Soviet.
From all over the Middle East, they flooded here to kick out the Soviet Union.
Okufuma mu Middle East monse balishide kwa fetu bese babishefie USSR.
Now, if you want to spread a message, this was a good opportunity.
Kanshi ngorefo kusawankanya ili ashinembira yobe dishuko akwat.
They'd fly into Pakistan.
Enawale isa
And the Saudi Arabia began offering large discounts for anyone that wanted to fly to Pakistan.
Saudi atende kukupera itumenti nkulia wabalefo kwisa Pakistan.
Now the capital of Pakistan is about here.
Nomba musumbo kalamba wa Pakistan wabera.
The capital of Afghanistan is about here.
Ero capital ya Afghanistan na yabera aponalim.
If you know about the Khyber Pass, that's about here.
Ngamadishwa nchende yabera pasai apa.
And there's this town here called Peshawar.
Ero pali town ya pai tiko Peshawar.
Then this town becomes pretty much the petri dish where everything future is going to develop.
Kanshi town ya isa sankange chifure chikurusa na sumetala influence fiala isa chitikira mukundasi.
All along this border with Afghanistan,
Kanshi yonse umupaka uyu wapakana na
Saudi Arabia sets up hundreds of Islamic schools or colleges.
Saudi Arabia yabika po amasukulu ele nama colleges.
Hundreds of religious seminaries.
Kulongano kuingi kwa mipepele.
Just across the border from Afghanistan,
Kanshi fio kwa kukafie umupaka uyu from Afghanistan.
For all the fighters that have descended from all across the world.
They sent
their most radical Wahhabi clerics
and
what you had was mass radical indoctrination.
Some
of the graduates of these schools became the founders of the Taliban. And out of these schools would rise the fighters for Al-Qaeda. In Peshawar, there is a man, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. He is known as the father of global jihad.
The
Palestinian Sunni Islamic scholar. He preached both defensive and offensive jihad by Muslims. He settled in this hotspot. And he messaged a friend of his and said, "Come join me in Peshawar." There's big things happening here. That friend who pulled into Peshawar was Osama bin Laden. In 1988, bin Laden created a group called the Base Al-Qaeda.
1988, Osama bin Laden.
He went to Afghanistan in 1979.
Afghanistan 1979.
Yusuf Azam in Peshawar in it was 1986. In 1988, he forms the base Al-Qaeda. 1989, that war ends and the Soviet Union withdraws.
Which
means where are the fighters going? With all they learnt in the theological seminaries Saudi Arabia set up. They go home. And Osama bin Laden heads back to Saudi Arabia in 1989.
Osama bin Laden Saudi Arabia in 1989.
Determined to turn what he started here into a global network. Now in this history there's another issue happening.
80 to
88. And this is the Iran-Iraq war. They've been fighting a brutal war over this border. From 1980 to 1988. Because Iraq is unhappy with its neighbors.
Omulandu wako bati Iraki taisekeremu n'omwina omupalamano wako.
And the debts it's incurred because of that war.
Eryo n'enfa ekirimu nk'omulandu w'obubulwi.
We've taught at length before about how they invaded Kuwait.
Eryo tatya ekyo kai Iraki n'ayingira
Beginning of the Gulf War.
n'ayingirira Kuwait pakati ka Gulf War.
Now, this aggressive behavior by Iraq was unsettling for Saudi Arabia.
Ukuru okubi kukali kwa Iraki yareeta kwali okusuma mu mezi ya Saudi Arabia.
They thought Iraq would turn on them as well.
Baishire muno kutira Iraki kuti aishira na pali ifuna ikobere.
So Osama bin Laden sees his chance.
Kaishi Osama bin Laden amona kutira bapali kweshukwa.
And he tells the House of Saud,
Eryo isaiwa urukora kwa Saudi.
Your country needs protection.
Icharu kireka biro bukingo.
I have all of these wonderful fighters.
Ninkwataine abashirika abasoma busana.
Trained in the mountains of Afghanistan.
Abasambirishiwa mu mpirisha kwa Afghanistan.
Conservative, strict Wahhabi Muslims.
Eryo abayirimba mu kairi abashikamuli Wahabi mu misambire kufisambiro kyabo.
Let me bring in my fighters and we will protect Saudi Arabia from Iraq.
Kashine bonde myebo kutiranga machine futwalati michingirira ku lena Iraq.
But remember this dilemma that the House of Saud has.
Nyumba mwiraba obu bali mukayo fita beshibe kyakutira abena Saudi cyo bali.
They need that radicalism to justify their leadership.
Bena balefwaya abapulamo sana benga suminisho kutira obutungulushi wabo bulifye ifine bwabako.
But they're also scared of it.
Allied
to the West,
and in
the personal lives of the royal family, not living up to what they preach. So the House of Saud says to Osama bin Laden, thank you, but no thanks. Have the United States put their troops on our soil and protect us.
And
how does that go over with Osama bin Laden? Rejection by his own Wahhabi government in favor of the United States. This is an article by The Atlantic called The 20 Years War. It's written in 2016. Talking about Osama bin Laden, it says the following. His central lament was the presence of US forces in Saudi Arabia or the occupation of the land of the two holiest sites. Following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, bin Laden had offered to defend Saudi Arabia with his Arab Legion, but the Saudi royals decided that the US military would be a better bet. He ended up having to leave Saudi Arabia because he was no longer welcome there. So something else is happening in 1989.
Kanshi fintu fimbi vile chitika 1989.
Another name?
Naombi umuntu
Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He arrived in Afghanistan in 1989.
Kanshi uyo ali mwine mu 1989 elio aliko mu Pashwa.
And it was here in 1989 he was converted to radical Islam. He had not been before.
Elio aliko napa alibukire kuli abakulamu wa amaislam.
And he and Osama bin Laden know each other.
Kanshi niapa epo baishwanini na Osama bin Laden.
They don't get along.
Lero tabalendera pamoja.
Osama bin Laden is a well-educated and wealthy Saudi.
Osama bin Laden ni muntu asambirira kabiri wano nkawa Saudi.
Al-Zarqawi is the opposite.
Al-Zarqawi awe aliwa
From
kusana Jordan.
Semi-literate.
Wasambirira kuchitika.
He's described as a former street thug.
Described
as a former street thug. He was rough. And he is converted in 1989. Or within this context in Peshawar. By 1996, both of them, Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi, are in Afghanistan.
1996, Osama bin Laden and Zarqawi bonse bali mu Afghanistan.
And in 1996, Osama bin Laden declares war on the United States.
In 1996, Osama bin Laden alanda okutenero twaba mu na
I'm not trying to trim through all the waymarks. We're going to go quickly.
Kanshi jeko ku bikefing apacho ndepitiro rubi.
He has a number of issues.
Kwata ifindu ifingi nemilandu ishingi.
His primary one is the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia.
Mulandu wa kubalira poni kubapo kwa bena America mu Saudi Arabia.
So these two men are both within Afghanistan in 1996.
Chaba umwe babiri bonse apa mu 96 bali mu Afghanistan.
And to shorten the story, out of Osama bin Laden develops Al-Qaeda.
Kanshi uyo Osama bin Laden shari panga ilibumba Al-Qaeda.
Out of Al-Zarqawi develops ISIS.
Kufuma muri Osama bin Laden emu afumine Al-Qaeda elio muri Zarqawi emu afumine ISIS.
You can't call it ISIS. It's just we'll need that acronym later. Osama bin Laden decides that what he needs to do is attack on American soil.
Osama bin Laden na uchakutira kuya ikata pamushiri wa mu America.
So in 2001, nearly 3,000 men, women, and children are slaughtered.
Kanshi in 2001 impendwa kufika na kuli 3,000.
The United States invades Afghanistan.
Baafwa kanshi.
They're trying to hunt him down.
America na yaima baya barerunga uyu muntu.
He flees into Pakistan and hides.
Akutukira mu Pakistan.
Al-Zarqawi flees into Iraq.
Al-Zarqawi akufumukira mu Iraq.
So one flees to Pakistan
Omo abutukira mu Pakistan
and one flees to Iraq.
mbi afumukira mu Iraq.
Remember, they know each other, they don't really get along.
Nyamwishiba bali ishiba umono munankwe no batabendera pepamu.
Al-Zakawi kind of wants to start his own group.
Zakawi ai saryo kuipangira mwine bumba lya.
So in 2003, the United States wants to invade Iraq.
Kanshi in 2003 America ilefwaya okuingirira n'okubisha Iraq.
They need a pretext to do that.
Lero muri kimo kiri umupaka wali bakiteekyo.
They want the United Nations to support them.
Barefwaya UN okubatungirira.
So they send their most trusted diplomat to the United Nations, Colin Powell.
Kanshi batumine abasorosoro aba UN okuya mu kulanshani.
And what Colin Powell needs to prove to the UN
Kanshi no yu kan pa ichale ko kuchini kishakali ba UN
is that he can connect Iraq to
ena
Osama bin Laden.
chakutira refwa ampanye Iraq kuri Osama bin Laden.
And how is he going to do that?
Erochi ala tashan.
He's going to say the connecting link is Al-Zakawi.
Era ndo kutira ichile ampanye biri ni Al-Zakawi.
His evidence is that Al-Zakawi fled to Iraq.
Nechini kishuchako chakutira Al-Zakawi abutukire ku Iraq.
Like much of what the US did then, that wasn't actually technically true.
Ero nge findu fingifyo Amerika yachite pali yomulambika fyali fyachinga mukulu lolesha.
Al-Zakawi fled to a remote and lawless part of Iraq.
Uyu Al-Zakawi abutukire kunchende akutali kutaruka nemishi mu Iraq.
He was not known, protected by Saddam Hussein.
Ena ishibikwe na kuchingirirwa na Saddam Hussein au.
But for the United States at the UN, he becomes their connecting link.
Lero kuve na Amerika bena bangu bonsho kutira chalenga.
And therefore at that moment also becomes quite famous.
Ero na pali yonishita chaisa chabe fyo asanguka waishi
Then
kwa
the
sa.
United States invades Iraq anyway.
Muricho Amerika yakwata okuya lunga Iraq.
They topple Saddam Hussein.
Baafumya hapo na Saddam Hussein.
They then do something that many people believe was their biggest mistake.
Ero baya chite chintu chimwe chwabengi basumino kutira wali mu kusoka lamba sana.
And they essentially fire the entire Iraqi army.
Okuya tansha n'okupasa abashirika balya abamu Iraq.
And Iraq is mostly Sunni.
Ero Iraki abantu abengi masuni.
So you have this angry Sunni army.
Kanshi kuti mwamona nomba hapo makwata ababashirika masuni fye
All of a
bafu.
sudden out of a job with nowhere to go.
Baleshe ababa tamfya matitorio tabakwete nokwakuya.
And no leadership.
No butungulishi.
So where will they go?
Nomba ni kwisoko balaya.
Well, Al-Zakawi was ready.
Kanshi kare Al-Zakawi yaliwa
He
ijia.
and a number of other people brought in these soldiers.
Ena na bantu abarekana aleta ababashirika.
And in 2004, he formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Kanshi in 2004 apanga Al-Qaeda mu Iraq.
So first of all, he was just kind of on his own, doing his own thing.
Kanshi akubalira po alifyo mwineka alete fyakwe.
But the US had been fighting Al-Qaeda for about 3 years now.
Pero USA yali lero ana ekubisha Al-Qaeda nombe myaka itatu.
Al-Qaeda is is very weakened.
Eyo apa Al-Qaeda pana inashiwa.
It's a little bit more complicated.
Awe vyali kobenganifi.
There's quite a number of leaders in Iraq taking in all of these soldiers into these extremist groups.
Kanshi kulia abendu abengi intungulushi muiraki baleta aba baleta mwibumberi ya
Al-Qaeda was known as the most extreme and the most brutal.
Eyo yo zakawa lishibiko kutira ewa kulishamo abitisha.
So he has developed a name for himself above all the other leaders.
Kanshi ali pangire no mwire kutira pali bonse ntungulushi.
And Al-Qaeda over here, feeling the pressure of the US resistance,
Eyo Al-Qaeda bale umfwa kubwesishiwa muno kukanwa na maka ya Amerika.
even though there has been this tension, this dislike between the two men and the two groups,
Angola pali ubuli pakati kawabantu nokana umfana wino.
and kind of like McDonald's or a supermarket chain, they reach out to al-Zarqawi
Ngefe chaba kumarket Afrika kwatu McDonald's Afrika wakuli Al-Zarqawi.
and say, we'll support you, come under our Al-Qaeda banner.
Disa to ala kutungirira isa sobe mwi mendera ya Al-Qaeda.
And he agrees.
Eyo ali sapato kusumina.
So in 2004,
Kanshi umuntu 2004.
he names his branch Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI.
Kanshi aita gichunga chako mwiraki kutira Al-Qaeda.
All of that is suppressed by the United States war effort.
Ifyonse aba bonse bale kwato kubatinke no kubagwesesha mu kuli ba
And he ends up being killed by a US airstrike.
ena kwimpelepele bakwete okumwipa ya kuli ba America omwi.
So from 2004 to 2011,
Kanshi kufuma mu 2004 kufika mu 2011
they're not having a lot of success.
tabakwete sana okulaki.
In 2011, the Arab Spring sparked the beginning of the Syrian civil war.
Kabiri mu 2011 yemo twamana obuluwa tendeka wa Arab.
So Assad is a brutal dictator.
Kanshi mfumo ya Saudi dictator.
You have Assad
Assad ni dictator
and the
atumkwata.
rebels.
Ero kulina ma rebels.
Now, for most Western countries,
Eyo ama country ya west
and a lot of others,
ukubika pona yambi.
it's kind of easy. Good guy, bad guy. Sorry, bad guy, good guy.
Ena lebo kutira uyu mubi uyu musuma.
Assad, bad guy. Rebels were the good guys.
Assad mubi ababa chipondoka ebasuma.
So it seemed simple.
Anshale muneke changu.
So Assad says, I'll make this harder.
Eyo Assad alando kutira nalati nenge chimuneke chakusa.
I'll make it hard for these countries that claim to believe in civil rights
Nalati nenge okube chakusa kuli fifya mono kutefya sumina munsambu.
to support the rebels.
Okutungirira bachipondoka.
So what he deliberately does is empty Syria's prisons.
Kanshi mukute mumine chachitire kuyafumya abafungwa abamusiriya
He
bonse.
knows when he empties the prisons,
Alishiwe kutira ngafumya abafungwa
the most radical, extremist, violent prisoners
bali aba bisana aba banka bayafya abafungwa bali.
quite a number of terrorists,
Eyo abengi mpendwa y'amaterrorista
they're going to flood into the rebels.
beena balayano okuyingira muli abamu bachipondoka.
And he deliberately orchestrates that to make it harder for Western nations to support the rebel groups.
Eyo atitire fi kuleka baba kuwesti fyalo kibe kyafya okutungirira amarebels.
So all of a sudden, there's all of these rebel groups formed, many of them filled with former prisoners.
Anshinga kuti mwaona nomba avava tipondoka abengi vaiswiremo navantu abengi avafumire muchifungo.
Now remember, Al-Zarqawi is dead.
Nomba ibukisheni info yakwa Al-Zarqawi.
Al-Qaeda in Iraq is quite shrunk and struggling.
Anshi Al-Qaeda mu Iraq irego ya irechepa nokuya irepwa.
But they've shared Al-Qaeda and they have now called themselves the Islamic State in Iraq.
Lero bafuma muri icho basha Al-Qaeda ero bambo kuita bene kutira ichalo chama Islam.
So they went from Al-Zarqawi 1989.
Kanshi baenda kufuma muri Al-Zarqawi in 1989.
Forms his own rebel groups.
Aipangira amabumba yakwa ya kupondoka.
Goes into an alliance with Al-Qaeda and becomes Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Elio ayamua mpano na Al-Qaeda ele aisaba Al-Qaeda mu Iraq.
They have a new leader.
Elio bakwate ntungurushi ipya.
Just prior to the Arab Spring.
Ilio fie takulaba bubulu watendekera mu 2011.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
They shared their connection to Al-Qaeda.
Kanshi barikwete wampano na Al-Qaeda.
Call themselves the Islamic State in Iraq.
Bena baita kutira ichalo chama Islam Iraq.
The Syrian civil war area opens up for them.
Ilio buriwa isuka ku Syria chabesukira bena.
They absorbed many of Assad's freed prisoners in the rebel groups.
Aiba sendera na bena bengi amarebo elio na bafungwa bakwa Assad.
And renamed themselves now the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS.
Elio baita kutira uteko wa Islam mu Iraq ichitikwa mu wipi ISIS.
What I want us to be able to do is trace how it developed. I won't go a lot into the history past this.
Inshallah sana muri ashiria kare muri ifi uchirukapa.
I believe ISIS really forms around 2012.
Kanshi mu kufika po ISIS yapangilwe sana mu 2024.
Declare a caliphate in mid-2014.
Baita kutira caliphate mu 2014.
2014 was ISIS at its height of power.
2014 yali ni ISIS na ifika pamulu mu maka yaiko.
But the end of 2014 also saw the turning point.
Lero na mukupwa kwa 2014 kwali kumuna.
This is known as the Siege of Kobani.
Kwaruka kwa fintu wete kutira upika tuwa kwa Kobani.
So while it is at them as a caliphate at their height,
Kanshi chimocha kumuna kutira baita kutira caliphate na ifika pamulu hapo.
in December begins a fight over the city of Kobani.
Lero mu December watendeka oku ikate misumba nga Kobani.
They initially win, but then they begin to lose that in early 2015.
Mungu tendeka bali chimfya lero batendeka okulusa mu 2015.
Under the pressure of the United States.
Mulandu wa makaya lero mfishiwa kuli USA.
And from 2015 to 2019, they're gradually pushed out.
Yokufuma kanshi mu 2015 kufika mu 2019 bena basunka kubawesha sana panshi.
But in the time period of their height, they carved out a state the size of the United Kingdom.
kanshi mukuya kwa muluko baisa kwata okusenda ichichalo chabo
2019, Baghdadi is killed.
kanshi mu 2019 Baghdad baipaya
And they lose the last of their land.
eryo bena balusa nempanga yakwe bashireko nayo imo.
What I wanted us to be able to do was trace the history.
kanshi icho nachiraisha okulonda iliashi ife lyaende
And
lyakati
go right back to Wahabism.
okuwerera kuli icho ekipiribula Wahabism.
This was not mainstream Islam.
ngawe tayari ni Islamu hiyo twaishibikwa
But it was taken on and spread in Saudi Arabia by Saudi Arabia.
lero kyasenderwe na Saudi Arabia
Exported to the
n'okukisawankanya
Muslim world and beyond.
eyo n'okukisawankanya ku fyalo fyamu Muslim n'okukira
As the need to legitimize their government.
ng'enshirafe yaabo kuleka basungiremu obuteeko bwabo.
There is an article in the New York Times from 2016.
Muri pepara lyaba New York Times ilyalembere mu 2016
I think it's number 8 in your document. It's called Saudis and Extremism, both the arsonists and the firefighters.
litukokutira amasaudi n'okukulamu eryo bonse babiri
It describes this tension within Saudi Arabia. They are under threat by these radical Islamic groups.
ena kanshi bali abakusakamana kuli ayama Islam
By the
amabumba
fires they actually set in the first place.
kanshi ku muliro uyo winefe oba abikaku abene.
And this is one theory around 9/11 that is not a theory.
kanshi chisambire timo kulesha bali 9/11
That the country that George Bush did not want to touch was his ally.
okutira ekyalo kimo ekyo tayefaya okwigatako George Bush
And it was his ally that was primarily responsible.
nicho ekyo bali nakyo muwa mpano ekyo tabasa kamene
All but a few of the terrorists were Saudi Arabian.
ekyali ikyamulando ikyali ni Saudi mwali
It's
amaterrorist
a minority sect of Islam that Saudi Arabia sent mainstream.
kanshi kapukutuka abantu abanono amaisilamu ako Saudi yalengere okutumana
All across the world.
n'okusabankanya mukati akakyalo
Thousands of mosques
amamosiki mindapendwa
sending out their own clerics.
okutuma n'okutwala ebisambiriro
It
byabo
was organized.
awe kyena kyalife ekyatandikwa bwino bwino
What Saudi Arabia has never been able to do
lero ikyo Saudi Arabia yafirwana ukukita
what that family has never been able to do
nangula ikyo luli olupo lwafirwa ukukita
is control it.
kugwesha
So they end up suffering under the fires that they lit.
okutungulula otutunyo tubungwe n'ebisambiriro basambirishe kanshi
We don't have time to go through that article because I want to make another point before we close.
kanshi tatwabo yewe okukwa mulifi ndefu afembula ekikomona kimbicho ndefu ayireta tulaisale
So tomorrow I'll put it out on the media broadcast.
kanshi mailo nkala ibike ekimuli ashiri nsaba nkanishamu mulabasa wanti
I'll just read these two quotes.
kanshi narabirenga fe ayama paper nangu ayama shuwi
Saudi leaders seek good relations with the West and see jihadist violence as a menace that could endanger their rule, especially now that the Islamic State is staging attacks in the kingdom, 25 attacks in the last 8 months by the government's count. But they are also driven by their rivalry with Iran, and they depend for legitimacy on a clerical establishment dedicated to a reactionary set of beliefs. Those conflicting goals can play out in a bafflingly inconsistent manner.
Kanshi icho abaintungulisha Saudi chamwene ubusuma mugwa mpano na aba West elio nokumana ama jihadist kutira bali aba bankabesana kutira tafiri winwe nokumana kutira firele ngo usan kubika mu busanso obutungulishibwa bona kuchirisha ichalo chaba Islam icho ichale sanswa kanshi nali 25 Mumie chapter 8 uteko ubo kulingana kupenda lero na bena bakwata okuponena mubu afya mubwine kuli Iran elio no kushintirira pautyo okuchinda mibwa.
There is a broad consensus that the Saudi ideological juggernaut has disrupted local Islamic traditions in dozens of countries, the result of lavish spending on religious outreach for half a century, estimated in the tens of billions of dollars.
Kanshi kwaliwo kukusaranganya ifimu chapamo misamilisha n'ekisumiro ky'aba Saudi okufumiapo ifyofyo abenefya mu Muslim bakwata okusoma n'okwishiba mu fyalo efingi ene kyatumbukira nkulu gwomfya information
gutumbukira seconds to make a controversial point.
Kanshi ninkwata insashitatu okulanda palifi komwe fyala mfike
I want to go to an article in the Atlantic that was written in 2013.
Nalaya kwipepa lya muri wa Atlantic lya lembero 2013.
It's titled "Stop Blaming Colonial Borders for the Middle East's Problems."
Mutwatira legeni okupere milandu kuli balya abakaleba bikire mipaka.
I don't know how many people in the movement are aware of John Stewart and John Oliver.
Kuli ku Middle East nshishi babenge bali mu movement nga bali shiba John Stewart na John
in the left wing branch of the United States.
Mukulekeresha kwa kuresha
they are famous comedians.
Muchalo cha America kwali bako
but they are most famous for how they make understand and present political subjects through comedy.
Bali ishibikwa sana pamulandu wafyo bagule efisambiro fya makanisa fya chalo nefyo bafibika n'okufirondolera bwino mukusekesha kwabo.
And both John Stewart and John Oliver are extremely influential.
Kanshi wonse babiri John Stewart na John Oliver wonse bali kwata ulongolo sana mukachakata.
John Stewart running the Daily Show from the 1990s.
Kanshi John Stewart bombane veta kutira Daily Show from the 1990s.
And through comedy on the Daily Show, he battled Fox News weekly.
Kanshi kupitira muri Daily Show mu fya kusekesha fyabo alalwa sana no na ba Fox News.
So you have John Stewart on the Daily Show.
Kanshi namkwata John Stewart Daily Show.
And John Oliver got known by working with him on that show.
Hello, John Oliver na aishikwa alabombana nkwe palidia tunshi chawo.
And in 2013, they did this political act that was meant to be funny.
Kanshi na mu 2013 bapangire ichicha kusekesha cha mufikanza fya chalo chamunekenge cha kusekesha kwa bantu.
John Oliver dressed up as a 19th century British explorer.
John Oliver afuelenga explorer wa from Britain mumane ba 19.
And with sarcasm saying to John Stewart,
na meshui aya musarura rande figuri John Stewart.
"There's nothing the Arab respects more, John, than a strong, steady white hand drawing arbitrary lines betwixt their ridiculous tribal alliances."
Ukutira tapaba kwefyo abama Arabu bakwata kuperera ko muchinshi John. Ukutira pali ififya kumono ukutira babuta bashira.
Recently, the Daily Show joined the growing consensus of commentators declaring that arbitrary, carelessly drawn imperial borders are to blame for all that's wrong with the Middle East today.
Na bapenefye muri Daily Show kulingana nefyo barangire balanga kutira babalanda bafindi filistika balanda kutira ifife balandire mukukana bika kwa mano byalanga okutira mipaka
In doing so, they demonstrated that it's easy to be incredibly funny and dangerously wrong at the same time.
Okutira imipaka teyalenga ififire chitika kumindo isitire lero ngutiteti chalangisha okutira awe wangu
There's plenty to criticize about the legacy of colonialism, but dwelling on colonial borders only increases the risk that our future interventions in the region will further undermine its already fragile states.
Okutira kwena kwaliwo efintu ifingi ife mungalandira kwona bali ababatekerya kale amakolonyo lero okwikala pali ife okutira emipaka ile babikire yalenge efifire chitika ku Middle East mukwaidefyo.
The idea that better borders, drawn with careful attention to the region's ethnic and religious diversity, would have spared the Middle East a century's worth of violence is especially provocative at a moment when Western powers weigh the merits of intervention in the region. Unfortunately, this critique overstates how arbitrary today's Middle East borders really are, overlooks how arbitrary every other border in the world is, implies that better borders were possible, and ignores the cynical imperial practices that actually did sow conflict in the region.
Anshi irangulo shija kutira imipaka yashirwa bwino okulingana n'emitundu y'abantu ife bayikamu kusana yeyaleta mu okufuma ku myaka eyakunu mukutira yaleta obusansano okulu okukwaba mu nkyende shimoshimo okutira maka yalenga ya kuwesti awe ifyo kukuleka bengiremo nakuba nokuyalekeresha efifimbi ife atitikane bulubule chitika ku Middle East kutira byalekeresha okanalwesha kono bunkalo bwakutekeresha ubwabikwa okuli bamo abayibika okuba
I'll skip a little of the next paragraph where it talks about Ottoman boundaries and Mesopotamia. Starting from the word meanwhile, about 7 lines down. Meanwhile, the fact that Iraq's eastern border with Iran, this border here. Meanwhile, the fact that Iraq's eastern border with Iran followed a line set by the 16th century conquests of Solomon the Magnificent didn't prevent the two countries from fighting a decade-long conflict over it that killed 10 times more people than all the Arab-Israeli wars combined. It's this border that killed 10 times more people. Arab-Israeli wars combined.
400
years old and was set by Solomon the Magnificent.
400 years.
To the west, Mount Lebanon had been carved out as a special administrative unit following religious violence there in 1860 as a compromise between Istanbul and the great powers. That this region should nonetheless belong to Syria was perhaps one of the Assad regime's least controversial positions over the years. The only country in the area for which no ancient borders existed was Jordan. It was formed in 1922 from some not too desirable bits of arid land as something for Britain's ally, Abdullah, to be king of. Like most kings, he would have liked something bigger, and yet under his family's rule, Jordan has been spared much of the turmoil endured by its less artificial neighbours.
Namula chinga befyo, Iraki kuluku east kumpaka na Iran. Yakonkana n'omuchirwa okulolesha kuli 16th century umo amabulwi ayo Suleiman uyo atitire kuleka English ebyalo timbu kufuma kanalwa myaka owasenda nokwifaya abantu abengi sana muri iyo nshita ukukira bamabulu yonse ayatitika mukati ukuyabika pamu mumala na kuba ku west banon na bambi okubika kufina ubutungurushu okwakonka kumipepele n'obulundwa na 1860 au fiele fyonse fyaleetwa pamu tambuko na makaya kalamba.
I'll skip the next 2 paragraphs for time, but they're all relevant. So they say, what if the British and French had created one big Arab state? Any such state would still have faced difficulty with its Christian, Kurdish and Shiite minorities, and with Iraq, Egypt, Syria and Saudi Arabia all asserting their own claims to preeminence in the Arab world, the question of leadership would have been contentious.
Avena Kristo, Kurdish, Shiite minority area.
Most appealing, perhaps, is the idea that things might have gone smoother if the Europeans had just left the region's inhabitants to sort things out themselves. This is what happened in the Balkans, where local leaders drew their own borders and the fighting lasted up through the 1990s. I'll skip the next paragraph that goes into Africa and Sudan. The fundamental problem was, and still is, that the world doesn't have any authentic or natural borders, just waiting to be identified and transcribed onto a map. Europe's real borders owe their current legitimacy, such as it is, to continent-wide exhaustion following several centuries of fighting. Winston Churchill may have drawn the border between Iraq and Jordan with a pen, but he was just as central in delineating the border between France and Germany when he led the Allies to victory in World War II.
Lero ekyo balero lera kyakutira kumbe okubika kwenkishi biro ekyakulanga mapu iyo efyo Europe yaba mipaka esho yakwata iranga okutinda mibaiko ngefe kyali fye kukyalo ekikalamba n'ekikutura kyakyalo nkukonga okutira efyalo mumasenchari byabe byakuwa Winston Churchill ngaalingirye okushira mupaka pakati ka Jordan
Determining whether Alsace and Lorraine would be French or German was never as simple as just sending a commission to find out where the French people stopped and the German people started. Rather, the territory was awarded as a prize following each of the Europe's bloody conflicts. Similarly, no commission, no matter the good intentions, could have been expected to find the magic line that got all the Sunnis on one side, the Shiites on the other, and the oil right in the middle.
Kanshi okubika kofe inefya konkapo okolosha kuli Lorraine ivyo mu French cyari na German. Tacyari kintu cyanguka okutuma wa ibumbere yakuyalanga no kwaya impesa kwa beka shiba mu French bakwatire Perera na German yapo yambi. Ifi takyari ifi akoloshe fyo kutira cyakupera fe kirambo kuli abo abarekonga Europe mu bakwatye obulwi obwakusumya emiropa. Lero kyali fe fyafaanana nkuli abo komishe kwabula okupeera ye
So
kyakulangira
what happens then if you work around ethnic groups and create them precise?
kuleka babiika amasuuni okwo nako balaperera n'amashaiti okwo era nawoyiro ibe pakati kaabo kanshi takyali kyangu
I'll skip the
kanje
next paragraph, but he discusses what the Soviet Union did in Central Asia.
alatolokako na kabiri kaliyo museera olaenda pali Soviet Union na Asia.
It didn't, in short, it didn't work.
Takyabwa mbere mubwefu.
In the last two paragraphs, he discusses what the real problem is.
Anshi mumaparagrafu akulekeresha abiri emwalala ndoro ubwafya
It's not colonial borders.
kanshi emipaka ireyo bashiire abategere
If you think
kwefyalo
borders are a problem,
nakuti abe emipaka yaba bwafya
look to Europe and 2 world wars.
ndolesheni ku Europe n'amagulu yali ayayesonde lyonse.
They're always messy. Winston Churchill drew theirs as well as some in the Middle East.
Kanshi chacho ashirire iwabo ingafira birefe cyari ku Middle East.
And he says that drawing attention to the wrong problem
Erwando kutira okuwula okulosha amatontonga yesu kubwafya obushiriyo
distracts from the real problem, which has been alliances.
kingirisha okufuma kukanalosha kwa bwafya obulipa kwampana.
I also post this on the media broadcast.
Ashifyo fyaliranda muri muzabasa.
So I wanted 2 points from today's study. First point,
Ekikoma kyakubalira
we have to understand history correctly.
tulingire okukwata okwiruka eri ashiri akale mu kitundu.
When we don't understand history correctly, we twist and form a wrong worldview.
Kwebonga tatwirwika eri ashiri akale bwino efe lyaba twalakwata okusankana n'okupota kubika kwamalangulushi Yesu.
And prior to the message of 2 streams of information,
olesha pambira ya mironga
so
ibiri
many people in the movement just used fast brain thinking
abantu abengi mu movement Yesu babomfeshefye bongo wa fast mukutontonkanya
to accept any theory that came their way that fit with their ideological belief.
bena balepokera fyo bwangu ebisambiriro efyo fireisa mu mirongo uli wonse ule yampana n'efyo bakwata mu
This
mitwe
is
yabo.
2 streams of journalism.
Kashi mirongo ibiri yabasabankanya eri
There is the danger in the movement that we continue with fast brain thinking
kanshi obusanso ukalamba wetuletwaile nabo mukataka ino movement kubomfya bongo wa bwangu
fed off comedians, social media, YouTube,
tibabani bali abafya kusekesha nangula iri ma social media
influencers,
kanshi social media kutira imanine ko efingi
and snappy memes.
kubika kofe na mameme
Things that already agree
evintu
Things
ifingi
that agree with our worldview because they seem left-wing.
evintu ifisuminkana nefe fwe batumane nchara pantu firefu mina kuba left yoku.
If you say, well, if they make some mistakes, what's the harm?
Ngabalufyanya ushitali
And I'm saying there is a harm.
nebondera ndokutira awe busanso
It's frankly dangerous
eri omukitunturufye kiri kyamu
for
busanso
everything
butala
you imbibe and the work you're meant to do in a couple months' time.
kanshi ngakutumwamona wanwa okwetefye omulimo olingiri okubomba mu myeshi ino nokuntashi
Don't read into that.
tatwaye muli ifyo mukwaya.
The minute we twist the story to agree with our narrative, we're in danger.
kanshi yoine fenshita twa kotekeria shikuleka felibe nokusumisha efye twa ishiba nishitwa umusanzu.
And the message of two streams was never to turn people to the sources of information I see shared prolifically today.
Isamiro cha kusoma pa milonga ibita yawe ishiri okutira abantu bese uku babonda mikire kuleka bamone efintu
Our
fyafirire.
sources must be journalistic.
Emilonga iringire yaba byashiri sabankanishiwa byafirire. Okutontonkanya hapo mkushika.
Thorough.
Busaka.
It's okay. I'm closing. Someone, I know people have been sharing an article, and I'm not saying it's a bad article. But people are forming the position that the United States is to blame for all this, and frankly, it's not. I understand the danger that right-wing terrorism has in the United States today. But when ISIS launched 25 terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia in 8 months,
the radio ISIS ya kweto kubika ifya kutinya nefya kona olamu.
Do you think they launched 25 in Saudi Arabia and none in the United States because they gave up hating the United States?
Mulemo nokutira chali fyefi mu Saudi Arabia pamulandu wakati bashako America tatere chitikiramo?
No.
Yonkwa.
It's because the United States took precautions against Islamic terrorism.
When we
form these arguments, somewhere down the road we end up doing the following. Making excuses for religions and cultures that are oppressive and sexist. Quite a while ago, back in really early 2020 time period, someone wrote on Facebook, if it wasn't for the West, all of Africa would be successful democracies.
Frankly,
I don't agree. So much gets weaponized now to defend against sexism. And frankly, the left buys into it quite often. I am happy that there is a Muslim woman in Congress. Which we have to look at every day. I'm proud of her and I'm happy about it. But I also want to see these women freed. Just the way I would want a Mennonite woman to take off her head covering. We can only speak straight about universal human rights and women's rights. And LGBT issues across the world. We understand the world correctly.
nga kyakutira wairuka ekyalo kyobe bwino bwino mu
You
kitundu
can only understand the world correctly
nga naisuka bwino bwino ekyalo kyandi bwino bwino akiruka
if we are painfully careful with our sources.
nga kyakabaye tuli abayibambira sana n'okwisakamanya muli umwe tulefunya eryashi.
What happened September 11, 2001?
Ikyakitiike September 11, 2001.
The men, women, and children that died in a couple of hours.
Abaume n'abaana gashini n'abaana abafiire amawala ayo.
Let's call it what it is.
Uyita fefefine fye kyali.
It's truly awful.
Kyali kyabipisha kyabulani.
And that extremism has not gone away. And the United States has made terrible mistakes. Including mistakes that impinge on universal human rights. We cannot let that distract from a correct perspective. The oppression that has also grown up has spread within religion and culture. And whenever we encounter it, inside and outside of this movement, there is no excuse. And we ought to be close in prayer. Dear Lord, so close to the end of our reform line. We're meant to be servants. Priests. Lord, any chance to still prepare? Whether not with laziness or lethargy. May we also see our personal need to form a correct perspective so that we can be of use. Pray that you will bless your people. Many of them still in the Sabbath hours. Elder Palminda, is he soon to present? And all across the world as they remember this date. And the few moments that brought such destruction. I pray, Lord, the world might awaken. Beginning with Adventism. Will they see the hope in the methodology of this movement? See the meaning of what we teach. Yes, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yes.